When we're working with parents and children who have experienced the loss of a beloved animal companion or are in the process of taking care of an animal who's dying, there's some things that you want to keep in mind that apply to children. One is that we are raising children to become adults. Always want you to keep this in mind. We are raising children to become adults. And so having an animal companion provides many lessons that are wonderful for helping with that process. An animal companion helps a child to learn responsibility, gentleness in touching and being with something alive that is more vulnerable than the child is. And we learn all kinds of lessons about nurturing when we're children and we have an animal companion in the family. One of the most important lessons also that an animal companion gives to a child is a window on the life cycle. And the final lesson that an animal companion imparts to a child is that all life ends and that we all die, all living things die, and that this is a natural end to life. And so it's important to keep this in mind, that this is something we don't want to shield from children. It is something that will help them to understand what life is, how life moves, and how life ends. And this is something to help your parent clients understand so that they can keep being supportive of their children as their children experience what's happening with the animal companion who's a member of the family. I have too frequently seen parents who try to prevent their kids from even knowing about the loss of either an animal companion or a human relative. I once was called upon to provide support to a couple who were experiencing the sudden death of one of their parents. So the husband's mother had just died unexpectedly, and she was very much a part of the family when it came to her grandkids. So this couple and their two kids, who were 8 and 6 years old, lived in New Jersey, and the man's mother, lived in Westchester County. So she was a very short distance away in New York State, and she would visit with regularity. And this couple told me that their plan was to tell their kids that their grandmother had embarked on a worldwide cruise on something like the Queen Mary. And I told them that I could certainly understand the feelings that would drive such a decision, that they were trying to protect their kids from the pain of grieving the death of their beloved grandmother. But I helped them also to see that they were instead substituting a fantasy, a story that would make it feel to her grandkids as though this grandmother had abandoned them. And so we worked through their pain at having to witness their own children's pain and grief. But there's no other course that makes any sense. That's the thing that you want to keep in mind. We have to help kids to deal with the realities of life. And so that's what this video clip is about. Some things to keep in mind. Kids tend to feel responsible for adverse things that happen around them. This applies to children of all ages, including teenagers. And so certain kinds of themes are common. So kids will say things like, if only I'd done my homework consistently, then Fluffy might not have gotten sick. Or if I had paid more attention and been more kind and just pet her longer or more regularly, she would have been more happy and she wouldn't have gotten this illness and died. And it's very common for this to be something that's rattling around in a child's mind, even if they don't say it. So one of the things that it's good to do is to coach parents to remind their kids that they played no contributing role in the loss of their animal companion, and that this is the result of forces well beyond their control. Of course, if they did something that was negligent or a mistake, that's different. But even if they don't mention it, even if they don't say the kinds of things that I just mentioned, it's a really good idea to just say to your kids, or encourage parents to say to their kids that, look, you may very well not be thinking this, or you may be thinking it, but so many kids do think this way, that I'd like to encourage you to just know that you had nothing to do with this loss. There's nothing that you could have done that would have made this different. Kids who are very young, below the age of 5, sometimes 6, sometimes 4, it depends on the individual, have a difficult time grasping the permanence of death. And so when their pet has passed, they will say things like, when is Sally coming home? Or when will they wake up? And it's important for parents to remind them that that's not going to happen, and to be very specific and concrete and say things like, our friend isn't going to wake up. They don't eat anymore. They don't move anymore. They have died. And to just say that in a way that is just very calm and direct as many times as is necessary, because eventually your child will grasp that. By 8 or 9, most children have a sense of that permanence, and they grasp death in more the way that adults do. It's important to keep in mind that grieving looks a little different for children often. So kids can be more labile than adults. Their emotions can change more rapidly, even than ours can often when we're grieving. Everybody's labile when we're grieving, but kids perhaps even more so. So they might be very upset and tearful, and then we'll just be playing as though nothing bad has happened, and then go back to being sad or asking lots of questions another time. This is all very normal, and it's just a little bit of a difference in the ways that we are generally wired in terms of our attention and the changes that can happen in the focus that we have, the difference between adults and children. It's important to invite kids to participate in whatever the family is doing that has to do with either preparing for the loss or memorializing the departed animal companion. So it can be the parent's decision whether or not a child, for example, is present at euthanasia. That's something that parents would want to talk about. Would it make sense? They'd ask the child, depending on what the child's age is, would you like to be there when our friend is put to sleep and help to end their suffering is ended? And again, no right or wrong here, as with most things that have to do with grief. Good to involve the child. It's also good to involve the child in rituals that the family constructs. So we had a kitten who died very abruptly when my son was about 6 years old. And we asked him, how would you like to remember Willie? How would you like to say goodbye to Willie? And we buried Willie in the backyard, and we all had cards that we read to Willie, and we buried them on top of her body. We had some flowers that we put on top too, and it was very moving and very poignant. I remember my son reading his card. He read a card that said, Willie, I'm so glad that you are my friend. I wish we could have been friends for a longer time. Very evocative. There were tears from all of us, but those kinds of rituals are important for kids, and it's good to help them to design the ritual. allow them to participate in designing the ritual. It's really important to keep in mind that you are always, 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 as a parent, your kid's primary role model. So some parents feel like, I have to be strong for my children. I have to be strong for my child. Well, in many ways you have to be strong, but you also have to be a role model. And if you are completely stoic, if you don't show any emotion, and your child is feeling terribly sad, they're going to feel alone in their sadness, and they're going to look to you and they're going to feel like maybe there's something wrong with them that they're actually feeling so sad. So if you're feeling sad too, which you may well be, you probably are at this circumstance, then it's a good idea to show that, to show your tears, to talk about your sadness with them, to hold them, to do things that allow you to connect with them in a way that shows them what you might call appropriate grief. Now, the one cautionary note I want to strike here is that you wouldn't want to become so demonstrative that it's frightening to them. You wouldn't want to scream and cry and lie on the floor and pound your fists, because you also want them to know that you're still there for them and you're still able to care for them. And again, you're always a role model. So you don't want to be a role model for this kind of complete emotional disintegration. You don't want that to be your kid's model for how I express my feelings when I'm sad and upset and grieving. Important to keep in mind, as we do with ourselves when we're grieving, that it's a process and it can ebb and flow over time, and to encourage parents to understand that their child may seem like they've completely integrated the reality that they've lost their pet, and then very short time later, or at an anniversary of the pet's birth, or the date that maybe they adopted the pet, or the change of season, the child is very much sad again and very upset about this loss. Very common, very typical, just as it is with adults. So the way that we want to nurture our kids is to help them to understand the loss, to experience and share their feelings in a way that is healthy and in whatever way suits them. So some kids will share more than others. Some kids will not want to say so much. They might want to do some coloring. They might want to do some drawing. They might want to do some play acting. All of those things are great. We're all different in terms of the ways that we express ourselves. And so you want to be encouraging of whatever way that best suits who they are and their temperament. And again, help them to stay in touch with reality. Don't tell them stories about the pet having gone to live on a farm or some other story that denies their pet's death. And also, it's a good idea to just keep talking about the lost animal companion as time goes on, because you don't want death and people who have died to become unmentionable. This is an important point as well. You want to continue to have an inclusive family story about those who are part of the family now and those who are part of the family in the past. This way, it allows your kids to hold on to memories and to talk about their lost friend in a way that becomes more and more just a part of their own life story. I'll always remember the powerful words of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers on TV, who said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. Keep this in mind. If it's mentionable, it's manageable. Everything in our life experience needs to be manageable, and therefore it needs to be mentionable.